James, for that introduction and also for inviting me today. So I would like to really talk a bit about the role of assessment in improving research culture and specifically qualitative assessment methods. And I want to kind of talk through this in three parts. One, to look first at why research assessment reform is a central lever to improving research culture. Then I want to come a bit, and this is the head-on that James mentioned as vice chair of the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment. I do want to touch on some of the core commitments within this coalition that really link back to research assessment and research culture, and qualitative assessments being assessment methods being central to that reform. And then finally, I want to spend a bit of time, and this is maybe more of a personal perspective, on exploring the opportunities that the use of qualitative methods can present for better assessing how research is being done. So starting from the first kind of part, I think it's important to first recognize that research assessment reform is really a central lever, on the one hand, to maximizing research quality, but for the topic of today, also to improving research culture. And to kind of make the case for that, I do want to go back to one of my first experiences in the research policy space, where I was working for the Royal Society on a program around research culture. And this was one of the imageries created from some of the conversations that as part of the program we were having with researchers. And so research culture, it's already been discussed a bit, and I feel most people now know what it's about. But I did want to start this talk with kind of iterating the definition that was given then, because I'll come back on some of the elements of that definition later. And as part of the research culture program, research culture was very much defined as encompassing the behaviors, values, expectations, attitudes, and also the norms of our research communities. And I'll definitely come back a lot to particularly that first words in that definition, behaviors, today. And so one of the big conclusions of the research culture program at the Royal Society was that at the kind of center of a lot of issues with research culture sits really a highly competitive environment combined with very narrow definitions of success. And I do want to also maybe point a bit to how poor research culture was defined as part of this program, and it really very much related to the research itself. So things like compromises on rigor and integrity, undervaluing of negative results, lack of transparency, barriers to diversity and inclusion. I also wanted to bring up one of the quotes from the Welcome program, and this has already been mentioned in previous talks today. So the Welcome program was coming maybe from a slightly different angle, so looking more at the effect on researchers themselves. So it's really kind of looked at things like bullying and harassment, stress, anxiety, also poor management practice, for example. But there as well, and I'm pulling here one of the quotes of Jeremy Farrar, at the time the director of Welcome, there was really a realization based on all those data collected and the program that the relentless drive to research excellence is creating a culture where there's much more care for what is achieved than about how it is achieved. And of course, this how relates back to that definition of research culture that we just discussed, which is really about the behaviors and the how research is done. So the big kind of conclusion here is, okay, if it's narrow definitions of success that are such a problem, then probably one of the solutions, and there's many others, I think we've seen many examples already today of how we can approach culture change, but I think one of the solutions that we do need to look at is how to broaden those definitions of success. And I think key aspects of achieving both researcher well-being on the one hand, but also research success at the other hand, is that a lot of aspects that are important to both of these are actually being under-recognized. And before I kind of dive into the next part of the talk, I did want to illustrate this with a few examples. The first example, and this is more around how we ensure researcher well-being, is pulling out actually quite a small part of what was a big report by the Royal Society of Chemistry on breaking the barriers. So this is a report around the retention and progression of women in the chemical sciences. And it looked at a range of issues, but I've pulled out here one of the issues that was identified in that report, which is that the progress of people, of their career, is dictated by narrow definitions of excellence. So again, kind of stating the same type of conclusion. And specifically, one of the things that jumped out to me here is that one of the points here is that efforts and successes in areas such as teaching and pastoral responsibilities do not count towards promotion and prospects. So one of the things that this says a lot about, this report said a lot about the kind of relationship with retention and progression, but the aspect I wanted to kind of pull out here is that clearly there's an under-recognition of those pastoral responsibilities. And again, they've come up earlier today as something that really needs to be central if we want to improve research culture. But it's not just impact on researchers, the individuals, it's also impact on research. And to illustrate this, I wanted to pull out a piece of research represented by this graph here. It's on my right. I'm not sure whether it might be on your left. But just to kind of zoom in on this piece of research. So this is a piece of research by Noemi Oberbon and Wim Pinkston. And what they are looking at here is they asked, in this case, they surveyed 126 researchers, mostly at Flemish institutions, and they gave 18 statements of what could be potential indicators of success. And they asked to indicate how important, so I think there's a rating from detrimental at the inner circle here on the graph to essential at the very outer edge, to kind of rate how important each of these are for, on the one hand, advancing science, and on the other hand, advancing their career. And so advancing science is presented in orange, advancing career in blue. And for those wondering what the gray line is, that is a reflection of how kind of the satisfaction of people relates to either of those. And so interestingly, some of the areas here on the side of advancing science, they link to diversity of ideas, to open science, to community contributions, career development, and collaboration. And people really perceived that those are much more important for advancing science than they are for advancing one's career. So again, there seems to be really in career progression and under recognition of a lot of the things that are also important for advancing the research itself, not just for kind of the care of the individual. So I think research culture and the health of research are really very much interlinked here in this perspective. So I hope that gives you a sense of the importance of assessment and changes to assessment in improving culture. And from there, if I can still move to the next slide, I wanted to move kind of to just first saying something more about current changes that are underway, because research assessment reform is underway in many forms. There's quite a lot of progress also being made here in the UK, but also at the European and even international level. There's a lot of momentum at the moment for changes. And I did want to specifically touch on an initiative that I'm very closely involved in, but I also really find very important, which is the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessments, and recognizing broader contributions, as well as reliance on qualitative assessment methods are central to that initiative. So I did want to say a bit more about that. So first, it's important to understand that this coalition actually comes together around an agreement. And this agreement was created, actually initially facilitated by the European Commission, because there was really a realization that assessment processes relying predominantly on journal and publication-based metrics can be a hurdle to the recognition of diverse contributions, but also contribute to an unhealthy research culture and an unaffordable publication system. And so building on progress that had already been made, because this is not the first initiative on assessment reform. We know, many of you will know about DORA, the Leiden Manifesto, the Hong Kong Principles. This agreement was really trying to establish a common direction for research assessment reform. And it was co-created by a lot of different organizations. So I was involved in that drafting process together with a core drafting team. But there was also a group that we consulted of individuals who are really helping with tweaking really in text, and then also consultation moments with over 350 organizations. So it was really a co-creation exercise. And so at the core of the agreements are shared principles, 10 commitments, but also a time frame for delivery. And it was published in July 2022. I did want to touch briefly, I don't have time to go through all the details of the agreement, but do please have a look at the CoARA initiative online. But the two that I wanted to just repeat for the purpose of this talk is the first one is around recognizing diversity of contributions to and also careers in research. And I think we've actually already heard also from the talk from Sarah and Catherine earlier, how important it is to recognize diverse contributions, but also diverse roles in research. And the second commitment, and this is the one I'll build the rest of the talk on, is to really base research assessment primarily on qualitative evaluation, for which peer review is central, supported by responsible use of quantitative indicators. And once this agreement was formulated, the kind of next step in this process that all these stakeholders came together around was to create a coalition for implementing not just these core commitments that I just showed on the previous slide, but also 6 supporting commitments in a kind of common direction for reforming research assessment. And so just very briefly on the coalition, so its mission is really to enable systemic reform of research assessment on the basis of these common commitments and with this time frame for action. And it really offers space for its members to learn from each other's experiences, but also really to advance the process of research assessment reform in and beyond Europe. The constitutive assembly of this coalition took place in December 2022, so it hasn't been going that long. But now we are really in the process of where members can submit proposals for forming working groups where really the work can start. And there's already 465 member organizations as of 4th of May. I did want to flag that the UK is not as hugely involved yet, I think, as some would have expected, considering there's a lot of progress already that we've seen in the UK. So I do want to encourage those in positions where they can take this to their institutions to really take part in this initiative that I do really think is important also for improving research culture. And so coming back a bit to that commitment around qualitative assessment. So I did want to just first say that there are already quite a few methods that are either well known to the research community or are really being kind of tested at the moment that are really looking at qualitative forms of evaluation. I think it's maybe worth noting that, of course, none of these are perfect, but I don't think any assessment method is. But there are really a lot of things we already know about qualitative evaluation. So, of course, first of all, there's the peer review process, which I think we can all agree is central to research. And this is, of course, based on a qualitative form of evaluation. In the UK, we all will know the REF. I'm not here taking a judgment on the kind of the various debates around this exercise, but it does to a great extent rely on qualitative evaluation as well. We know both that evaluation of the outputs, there's quite a lot of peer review involved, but also the impact case studies and environment statements also rely on qualitative forms of evaluation. And then a third example to bring here is all the various narrative CVs that are being tested in the UK, but also in other countries. So this kind of brings me back a bit to the very initial slide, because when I was at the Royal Society, this was one of the projects I was leading on. I was leading on the development of the Resumé for researchers that then has been kind of taken on and adapted by UKRI, and now is the Resumé for Research Innovation. But there's quite a lot of other countries who are looking at this format. So the report here in the middle is a report from the Luxembourg science funder. And then also there's a report here around looking at process optimization and bias mitigation in the use of narrative CVs published by DORA. And there's many other examples. These are just a few for illustrating the fact that qualitative evaluation is becoming really embedded. So what I wanted to then touch on in the last part of this conversation is looking a bit also at the exploration. And as I said, this is more of a kind of personal reflection of potentially kind of additional qualitative methods. So in addition to the ones I've already pointed to, in really thinking about the opportunities for better assessing how research is done. But also I did want to kind of briefly touch on, I think, some of the challenges that remain with that. And so the first question is, okay, what do we mean with assessing how research is done? So obviously this means looking at a lot of the aspects of research culture, but thinking really about how do we really assess those things. And again, there's already work underway to look at this. So I'm showing here again the REF environment. So I think those who are involved in conversations around the future of REF and the future research assessment framework will be aware that there's really thinking about how the environment statements can better capture the kind of the progress on research culture. And that will likely be a mix of qualitative, but also probably, where possible, some maybe more quantitative indicators. I'm curious really to see in the next few months, because I think we'll get more information from Research England on how this is developing. But it's one example of where this has really been thought about. Another one is also UKRI with Cancer Research UK and Guild HE, thinking about really exploring specifically research integrity indicators. And then, of course, there's also numerous initiatives where people are thinking about how to acknowledge open science practices better. And I've just given one example here, which is the OSCAM, the framework that the European Commission developed for these purposes. So there's definitely already thinking around, okay, how do we assess culture? I do think there's some outstanding questions where the community probably hasn't taken a clear view yet. And I'm referring here in both cases to reflections by Lizzie Gatt, who's also my co-vice chair in the CoARA initiative. And so the first piece I'm referring here to is a blog by Lizzie that's asking, measuring openness, should we be careful what we wish for? And she's really kind of questioning in this blog whether incentivizing open scholarship is best done by measuring it, or whether there's maybe reservations around it. And I do advise people to have a look at it, because I think it's a good piece to help us really reflect on that question. And then, of course, another question is, if we do go in that direction, what types of indicators, metrics do we use for that? And here I did also want to refer to a rule of thumb that's often shared, kind of accompanied with the scope framework, that really is there to help people reflect on how evaluation is done. And that rule of thumb is to use quantitative indicators for measuring quantitative things and qualitative indicators for qualitative things. To me, that would suggest that if we think about culture, we probably want to think more about the qualitative side of things, because we are looking at behaviors, values, norms, which probably are more qualitative than quantitative. But so leaving those questions aside, although I think they do need more reflection from the community, I did want to specifically suggest one tool, I think, in addition to the ones, because I think narrative CVs, for example, can already help us with those more qualitative reflections, but an additional tool specifically focused on bettering capturing process behaviors and competencies in our assessment processes. And as illustrations here, I've taken this image representing the research process from the Center for Open Science. You'll see that it doesn't only represent the process, but also issues occurring with that process. And then to represent the competencies of researchers, this is just an illustration here of the RDF, the Research Development Framework by Vitae. And so the approach that I wanted to just briefly touch on, and I have had discussions with academics about it, and I know there are lots of questions about it, so do share your reflections in the chat, is whether it would be helpful to kind of think about or explore whether competency-based elements would be useful in academia, and they are prevalent, they're used a lot in other sectors. I did kind of like this image from Hayes that actually really sets out what competencies, how they're different maybe from other things we're measuring, because competencies are really about behaviors. And this is where I'm coming back a bit to that very initial slide that set out the definition of research culture. How do we look at behaviors in an evaluation or assessment environment? And so where there might be potential to start using these, where they are maybe underused, is in areas where actually we need more reflection. And I'm coming back now a bit really to the topic of today. I think Ian Boyd started the day today with saying the element of confidence is also confidence in our ability to question ourselves, is also in our ability to reflect. And this could be a method to really embed reflection, not just in a kind of voluntarily way, but really in a way that that becomes embedded in the way that we assess the people we hire, the people we progress in their careers. And I've tried to give some examples of what competency-based questions could look like for questions around integrity, open science. EDI could have been added here, but also collaboration, teamwork, and forms of management, including people management. And so a few other benefits of including something like this could be also to decrease the gap between academic and support and research management staff, but also improving two-way intersectoral mobility, so the mobility between academia and other sectors in two ways. And the reasons are that this is not output dependent. This doesn't depend on having a track record of a certain type of deliverable that might be unique to one sector or another. These are usually questions and challenges that people across sectors and across roles can contribute to. And, as the central part is really here to reflect on how people approach things, on how they do things, on how they behave. As I said, I've been having conversations about this kind of suggestion, let's say, for quite some time, and there are definitely challenges with thinking about introducing this. So some of those that come up a lot is quantitative approaches are objective, qualitative ones are subjective. We cannot hire people because they are kind. People can invent their answers, and also will end up people who kind of can bring the best stories. And of course, I think with any new tool, this is something that would need exploration and research. But I do want to already kind of just give some of the replies around some of these. So I think the first thing to say is that quantitative metrics are not bias-free either. We know, for example, from a piece of research at the Royal Society of Chemistry that there are biases throughout the publication process. I think the kind of safest bet here is to actually assume that all assessment forms to some extent are subjective, and we need to think about mitigating that as much as possible. Then also the kind of this conflation between kind and able or competent, of course, those are really not the same thing. I think I know people who are, I wouldn't necessarily describe as kind, but they are competent in certain fields and skills. On the invention of stories, people also invent data, which probably arguably is worse. I think the benefit you have with a narrative is that whether it's completely truthful or not in terms of the competency approach, I'm not saying in other forms, you'll still learn a lot about the thinking of a person, the approaches they will have. So there's still quite a lot in there. Of course, there's also kind of thinking here about trust in people and what we need to do there, maybe to ensure that people can feel they can give trustworthy answers. And then also, of course, there are definitely things we need to, unintended consequences we need to guard for, but also we would need to think about where this tool fits, in which assessment processes it would be useful, along which other tools it would sit. So there's definitely thinking to do around those kind of questions, and this would be the start of that process and definitely not the end. And then finally, a lot of my reflections are really around how we assess individual researchers. Of course, within the research assessment reform space, we're looking at a lot of different aggregate levels, and I did want to just leave a kind of a caveat around the qualitative versus quantitative assessment at different aggregate levels. And I quite like this figure that is kind of captured in the NORCAM, the Norway toolbox for recognition and rewards, that kind of suggests that at the individual level, we really need more qualitative assessment, while arguably there could be value in more quantitative or bibliometric forms of assessment at macro levels. That being said, I do think there's also interesting explorations at the moment on how to use qualitative assessments at those aggregate levels. And I'm referring here to the More Than Our Rank initiative that's really looking at how institutions can, through stories and through narrative, really indicate their strengths rather than relying on the rankings, where we know there's quite a lot of issues as well. So then finally, just to kind of repeat what I hope you will take away from today. So I hope that from my kind of initial words, it's clear that research assessment reform is one of the central levers to improving research culture. I think we've really heard other examples, but I think today already, but I think this is really one of the central ones to achieve change. Also, that recognizing broader contributions and reliance on qualitative assessment methods are really central to research assessment reform that's currently underway, and with an encouragement there for those who are not part yet, the organizations that are not part yet of CoARA, to have a look and join. And then also that there are probably other opportunities to explore qualitative methods alongside some of those that are already being looked at today, especially for better assessing how research is done, so the culture, the process, and the behaviors. But of course, efforts will be needed to overcome challenges with first the development of those in a way that's suitable for the academic context, but also their acceptance and their implementation. And so I will end there, and thank you for your attention. I did want to just quickly still say, so for the organizations who are here, who have roots into their own institution to looking at something like CoARA, to join us, and also for those who are here more in an individual researcher capacity, there's plenty of things that you can do as well to be part of these conversations. I think joining this talk today is one of them, but also you can advocate or kind of be a champion within your own institution for things like CoARA. And then also there's very small things you can do in changing the conversation. One that I often give as an example is if you're in a conversation where someone kind of tells you they've published a new paper, don't let the first question be which journal they published in, but maybe think about who it can be meaningful for, or kind of other questions that pull that away from the current kind of publish or perish culture. And I hope that this gives everyone some ideas for improving culture, specifically through the routes that changes to assessment brings. And I'll stop there and stop the share so I can answer questions.
Karen, thank you so much. That was fascinating and insightful. It was great to hear your perspective from different organisations you represent, and also more about the work of CoARA. We've had a number of questions in the chat, and I think that shows the interest in your presentation, because you're in that, we put you in that difficult slot of the last presentation before lunch, but the chat and the Q&A has still been very lively. So we've got time for a few questions. Right. Where are we? Thank you. Okay, Norm's question said, I agree the focus on qualitative evaluation should be increased, but the challenge is in how to do this. How do you think the environment in smaller specialist institutions can be valued to the same extent as the larger, wealthier, multi-faculty environments?
Yeah, so that's a good question. In terms of I think there's maybe two elements to answer to. First, in terms of challenges, I think something that with qualitative assessment, something that often comes up is the time that's needed. I do think that at the moment, of course, we're looking at changing assessment, but within an existing framework. I do think there are questions around how often people are being assessed. Researchers are probably among the most assessed of probably any profession. So, you know, is there maybe an argument to make for assessing better with more of those qualitative tools, accepting that that takes more time and effort and resource, but then maybe assessing less often. So I think that's maybe just on the challenges. And then in terms of the recognition for all the kind of the different, let's say, diversity of institutions across the landscape. So I was actually recently in a conversation also with young universities that are perhaps not focused as much on some of the things that are scoring high in rankings. And I asked, you know, what are you most proud of? And regional developments came up as one of the things that they are proud of, but that is under-recognized. So I do hope if we can move to more qualitative forms and things like more than our rank, that each institution will find space to actually talk about those things that they feel they're uniquely placed to deliver, and that they will become more recognized for those things and less pushed by maybe norms set by some of these huge institutions or even actually by companies external to the research system that are often now setting the norm for what success looks like.
Sorry, I'm sure I'll mute myself. Thank you so much. Another question from an anonymous attendee: how can we include all research and not just research that's externally funded? What are your thoughts on that?
In the assessment, is there?
Yes, I believe so.
That's an interesting one, and I guess, I mean, if the I don't know whether the question is specifically to CoARA or whether it's a broader question, but I think
I'm afraid that was the length of the questions. I don't have any additional information, but just your general thoughts would be very helpful. Yeah,
so I'm just kind of thinking now in the context of CoARA, because that question has come up before. There is appetite there to really think about recognition across the research system, so that includes other institutions, so not just the ones who receive these external funding pots. And so again, if there are organizations who say, okay, we assess research, but maybe more in internal forms, and they're an interest to connect with those initiatives, I would encourage them to reach out, because that is definitely the kind of scope there is definitely to really include all the organizations who assess research in the research landscape.
Thank you. Inka says the tools for qualitative data are much less commonly understood and agreed on in her perspective, and she sees a need for expertise in this area that will help people make the qualitative assessments that are required. How can we acquire those skills? What are good sources, do you feel?
Yeah, very good question. And I would again, first of all, say that one of the ideas behind the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment is really to bring organizations together to have also more discussions around all the tools used, but including qualitative tools. So I think one of the things organizations can do is really take part in those discussions and also involve in those discussions. And we will be encouraging the working groups in CoARA to also think about where they can maybe link up with research on research, because we know that there are actually experts really working on this. There's in the UK also the Research on Research Institutes, but there's also several academic groups who are really looking into this. So it's also a matter of involving those in setting those practices, but then also working together and ensuring that we avoid big contradictions between countries, between institutions. And a lot of this is really what CoARA wants to bring, both bringing organizations together to have these discussions and develop tools in parallel and conversation with each other, but also to maybe provide some of those links with these expert networks who can also kind of talk about the state of the art of the research on some of this.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we have time for one final question before we break for lunch. Elizabeth asks, are you aware of any evidence that team narrative CVs for grants, for example, and the conversations that research teams have when writing these team narrative CVs, sort of shifting and improving research culture?
So I'm not aware actually of evidence, but I know there's a lot of research being done at the moment on CVs. I think the initial questions that are being asked around this is more how it affects career progression, how reviewers look at it. So I think we're still a bit in the infancy of testing some of these approaches, and I think it's logical that the initial research on this is very much focused on how they are used, how users find them, and what the immediate effects are on the purpose they're used for. But equally, I think it will be interesting, and I do think there are research groups interested in this, to look at, okay, what are the longer term effects, and that could include effects on are they causing changes in the culture, but also things like, are they causing maybe changes in the ease with which there is mobility between sectors. I think there's different areas where I at least, and I know of others who would be very keen to do more research to understand what the impact is of some of these new formats. But I think we're quite early on in understanding that, but I do think there's a lot of appetite to learn more and to really understand whether some of the impacts that we're maybe hoping for are actually being achieved.
Brilliant, thank you, that was really helpful. Karen, thank you so much for an insightful and fascinating presentation. It's great to see the discussion provoked as well, and you gave us a lot of big things to chew over and think about how we can apply. It was great to hear about the work of the organisations that you're affiliated with.